All right, final presentation for Read 437. This is just going to be a wrap-up conversation around putting together the case study report and how to take all that data and make it useful to your practice. So I'm just going to go quickly through the various pieces of putting this together and just talk a bit about some strategies that I think would be helpful to finishing up. The administration conditions in the background of the learner we've talked about many times. Those pieces are going to transfer over from the case study plan and other things that you've been uh, doing. And I just want to answer a really quick question. I've been asked a couple of times about what is it that I want from the question around providing the instructional context, i.e. the curriculum piece. And that is I'm not doing it just simply to make busy work. I want you to consider what it is the students are working on and how that might play a role in what they do know and can do. So any details you can give me about the kinds of work that they're doing, whether in the unit you're currently in or across the year, would be really helpful. So if you're giving a lot of running records and you've spent a lot of time in small group instruction on oral reading fluency, that might actually offer some insight into what the student can or cannot do in an oral reading assessment like the running record. So those surfacing those things is important just to get us as a possible cause or explanation for the student's performance. All right, so let's jump in on the findings. There's a couple of different ways to organize them. The one I've seen the most of you do is just simply to do by individual assessment. So a paragraph on your findings with your running record, a paragraph on your findings if you did a retell, etc. Others have asked me about a couple other ways of doing it, and that is if you did a running record and a miscue analysis, you did other oral reading pieces, you can put them together in one section or one paragraph describing. The other way to do it is if you gave them as a battery all at the same time. So if you gave a prior knowledge assessment, an oral reading fluency assessment, and then a comprehension retell, feel free to organize it around giving the multiple assessments around a single text at the same time. So those are three ways just to put the data together. What I'm looking for is I want a data table. And by that is I want you to choose the key findings and put them together like numerically and visually on the page. But I also want you to provide written descriptions of the findings. Again, you're summarizing both in written and in numerical form what you found. And again, this is the findings section. It's what we would say it's objective. You're not drawing conclusions here. You're simply saying this is how the student performed. So these are things like the proficiency level on reading. These are things like words per minute. The calculations should already be in the forms that you filled out. This is the number if they got right, etc. So use those numbers, report them out in paragraph form is essentially what I'm asking you to do. The other piece here is if the assessment calls for it, is I'm asking you to include both calculations and descriptive data. So a good example would be in the running record, you might list that they got 97% correct. Then you might also say that they had their errors tended to be meaning, and that they kept making this one mistake about using different words to describe furniture, for instance. Maybe it was um, uh, sofa and they said couch, except like repeatedly. So provide that descriptive data that actually, gives the insight into how the student performed. So I want to pass on. I've told many of you this already. I want to just sort of pass on an approach to the analysis section that I think is useful for at least some of you. And I'm not necessarily saying you have to do this, but I think given the data that you have been collecting, the questions that you're asking, it may make sense. And that is to sort of think about the analysis section into two subsections. And in the first, you're drawing conclusions about the student performance or ability, and in the second, you're drawing conclusions about why or how they performed the way they did. So in the first piece, in terms of drawing conclusions about student performance or ability, what you're trying to do here is you're trying to use all these multiple assessments, all this numerical data that you collected to kind of make a more summative assessment of the student's true ability in one or more areas. So if you're asking the question about what is their instructional level reading wise, that is a conclusion you may be able to draw from, say, doing the running record say from doing a retell, pulling multiple things to like definitively answer that question. So that's really what we're doing here. Up in the finding section, you're reporting out individually, hey, this is how the student did on this particular assessment, and you're synthesizing it in this analysis section to say, this is what I know about the student's performance. This is what they understand about the content they read, or this is, etc. Right? So I think what's really key here in terms of thinking about how to draw conclusions is identifying patterns across assessments, right? So, particularly if you gave a similar or same assessment. So many of us did multiple running records. You might have done one for the first running record assignment and then did another one in either a miscue analysis. So you might have like an A and a B to compare. And if you look at those two things and say, these are the patterns I'm noticing, or these are the conclusions I can draw, that's the kind of thing I'm looking for in the analysis section. The other piece is to just look at all of your assessments and say, what do I notice about the error correct pattern? What do I notice about the way the student is responding? Or what understanding they do and they do not have, and be able to say, I see this pattern, or I see this contradiction, or I don't see a pattern. There's a wide variety of things. So that's what would go in here, is looking across assessments, whereas the finding section is just reporting on a single assessment. So like I say here at the bottom, is this is going to be drawn primarily from the numerical data you have. So because you're trying to actually say, this is what I know about the student's ability level. So I would expect you to look across the actual numerical data that you have in order to draw those conclusions. It's a bit different in the second section here about the how and why, because that data is only going to tell you about what they did. In here, you're going to try to sort of figure out what are the underlying reasons and factors for explaining that. So here you're going to be answering questions around what's really informing why the student performed that way. So just to use an example, one student in the class, for instance, it appears, from my understanding, that what the student is asked to do, or the purpose of the task, seems to have a lot to do with how she might be motivated, engaged, or invested in the actual task of, say, answering questions about a text. So that you can't just simply get from like looking at how many questions you got right. The question really is about what actually might have caused her to answer the way she did, right? And so to do that, we're actually going to need to look at relationships among different types of assessments, not really push for the similar ones. So for instance, I pull up here the motivation survey and the retell. Is there something about her reading out loud, for instance, or answering questions or discussing their opinions about a text that might, on the motivation survey, that might tell you something about the retell piece? And I'm not saying it is there. I'm simply saying is that would be a way in which you could do some conversation between two data pieces that might inform your answer to, well, why did the student perform the way they did, or why does that student have that ability level? And so in this, you're really going to be looking at data from what I would call descriptive sources. So those are things like your observations, either during the assessments or in the classroom, things the student says, thinks, or feels, right? So these are things like if you did a motivation interview, if the student like was talking during their running record, perhaps they expressed their frustration, right? And they're also going to come from descriptive qualities of their performance, right? So by that I mean things that you couldn't quantify in terms of correctness. It might be like on the writing assessment, it might be their spelling, or the length of their assignment, or what their statements or their understanding look like towards the end of the response versus the beginning of the response. If you're thinking about motivation and persistence, for instance, you're going to think about like the how elaborate and how in depth their responses might be to comprehension questions, right? So you're looking inside what the student does, not just simply like how correct it was. Okay, implication section, this is kind of like the conclusion piece. The two ways I suggest going here is either to zoom in on really the next steps for the student, or really sort of the implications of what you learn from the student for future students, right? You can pick both, but I would pick whatever the case may be, it's really going to be about your purpose, right? So if your purpose here is that you're trying to set up the student for like the handoff to the next year teacher, or you're going to be working with the student in the future and you're trying to figure out a course of action, for obvious reasons, I think you're going to want to lay out the next steps for the student. If you have broader questions about your curriculum or your instruction, right, or small group pairings or just the pedagogy in your class, it may make more sense to think about what does the student tell you about future instruction. I can't stress enough the need to be specific as humanly possible in like talking about your recommendations. You don't have to have everything planned out. I'd rather actually you take a small chunk that you feel really strong about rather than trying to answer everything. So when you talk about this, don't just simply say, "Well, I need to work more on comprehension." Where are those needs, or where are the interventions you're thinking about, just in terms of content, the methods you might use, the learning environment, all of those things about what you might use to support. So I would think about like where can you really specifically address, and I would think think about those things, focus on that, and if you have more broad things about rethinking your groups, for instance, that's great. But everyone, I just will say that every student de technically deserves more differentiated instruction, deserves more small group instruction. Of course, obviously there's restraints on how to be able to do that, but I think those are givens. The question is inside of the differentiation, inside of the small group instruction, what does that look like, particularly for the given child or for future children? And so if you're looking for like a model just to sort of base how the writing is organized, Valencia and Booley, it's in the Week 12 folder, is a really good example of it. The focus, you have to understand they're not the classroom teachers and they focus on 6 students. So it's a little bit broader than what your level is going to be at. But the organization of them sort of saying, this is the need, and then this is what how we would respond to each of these students, I think gives you a sense of um, how to organize the section. If you haven't looked yet, the rubric is in the Week 12 folder. It gives more detail about the format as well as the rubric. I really want to like encourage the specificity over breadth. I have been uh, telling people that like if plenty of you have done lots of data, collected lots of data, you don't need to utilize all of it. I would really focus on the things that you can speak to well, and then use the other data is what I would call secondary data, just to confirm the things you have. So I would think be less concerned about having to cover everything equally than covering, I think, what you feel is really important and meaningful, and then using the other data to support that. And I stress this all the time. You cannot lose if you're connecting to the data throughout, not just in the findings section, but the analysis and the conclusion. If you're really making those connections, just like that are saying like the data makes it really clear the students need for X, or the data, like the data, these are the data that really support my analyses or the conclusions I'm drawing. You're gonna do great. The other piece I want to make sure everyone's okay on is that if the findings are contradictory and inconclusive, that's okay. That's actually in many ways expected. And the real thinking is, even if it's conflict, what can you draw from that? What do you know? Or what new questions does it raise from that? I think it's all about the approach here, and it's totally fine if you don't have a crystal clear path, and that the student might be doing things in one assessment that contradict in another. They're children, that doesn't shouldn't surprise you. In many ways. And then, again, when in doubt, include things in the appendices. So include a list of the QRI assessments you used, include the forms you put together. Because I just need to see everything you put together. So when I look at the data, and I can sort of help better understand what your thinking is as well. All right, really quickly, next steps. Email me a draft by 5 p.m. on Wednesday. So I pushed it back a day if you need it. Email it me on Tuesday if it's ready to go. I'll take a look at it on Tuesday. That would be great. But you have until 5 p.m. on Wednesday. I'm going to partner you up for a review, but I'm going to base it on submission time because people are going to have it into me at different times. So you probably won't be put with the person you've been collaborating with, but if I can, I will put you with that person. I am entering tentative final participation grades based on completion of the conference. So if you've done the conference already with me, you'll have a grade. But again, that's going to really the last thing to do is just the partner piece. So I'll check in with people to make sure that's done. Don't forget that the log indicating your activity, your clinical activity, what you've been doing in the classrooms around the data collection analysis, needs to be submitted to me by Wednesday of next week. The form is on the back of the syllabus. Write it down, fill it out, send me a scan so I can send it on to the program. One last thing, there's a survey in the week 12 folder. It's not the evaluation. Please do the course evaluation. It's really, I want to sort of present to you an idea of where I think we're going to probably go with this class in the future. I'm eager to hear both your opinion of my idea as well as any ideas you have as well about how to improve the course. Thanks.